Hey there guys, alright, today we are back with another Alternate History Hub video. This time, what if Germany won World War II, Part 3. Got nothing here to add on at the beginning, so let's go ahead and just dive right in.
Hitler's Third Reich has conquered Europe, and now rules over its people and governments with an influential hand. The meaning of European is quickly being changed. Individuality has been sacrificed for unity amongst every member of nations. The new Aryan generation, and by extension, other Europeans, are taught new curriculums. Europe against all, and against a new enemy. Not the Soviets, who have been pushed into the Siberian tundra, a force across the ocean, untouched by Nazi soldiers, the United States. If you haven't seen Part 2 or 1, click here or in the description below to catch up. In Part 3, I'm going to focus on how a Nazi victory has affected the United States. Europe may have fallen, but the United States with its impressive economic force still remained across the Atlantic. How does this affect our alternate timeline? Here is one scenario. America comes in, sucker punches Hitler in the face, then nukes Europe while jumping into the ocean. The end. Like,
got him!
On Facebook and no, I'm just kidding. An event like the
USA,
Nazis conquering Europe certainly changes global politics, but it wouldn't automatically put the globe under Nazi domination. Nations left uninvaded now have to interact with the Third Reich in their own way. Some could become collaborators, others staunch enemies, others future targets. In this video,
probably mainly future targets.
I'm going to focus entirely on just two nations, the United States and Nazi Germany. In this alternate timeline, Germany is able to secure Europe from outside American invasion. Even though the US could raise up a decent-sized army and military effort, the incursion into Fortress Europe would simply be suicidal, especially as the fascists begin reinforcing their holdings. While the other parts mention decades, this part will focus on the years immediately after Hitler defeated the British and continued to push back the Russians. In our timeline, the Pacific War and European War were disconnected from one another. Japan and Germany were both united in a goal for more living space for their people, but their alliance was one of convenience, not of ideological
They did not like each other all that much.
Similarities. By the time Hitler had invaded Poland, Japan was already waging brutal war against the Chinese in French Indochina. This war was noticed by the Americans, who placed an embargo to convince the Japanese to stop aggression. This oil embargo crippled Japan, cutting off around 90% of their oil supply and immediately placing them in a crisis. They could either stop their war effort, but instead they chose to go on the offensive, seize the natural resources of Southeast Asia, and negotiate with the Americans to maintain the land they conquered. Japan knew they could never win a total war against the economic might of the Americans, but if they were to cripple the US's fleet and stall their offensive capabilities, negotiation to Japan seemed like an option. In this alternate timeline, no matter if Hitler conquered Europe or not, Japan would have bombed Pearl Harbor to secure their own imperial ambitions. The United States is now at war with Japan in this alternate scenario as well. Yet even though the US does not want to wage a war against the fortified Germans, the Germans could still wish to fight a war against the Americans. In our timeline, Germany declared war on the US. Hitler did so under his own vision, and not because of any treaty obligation with Japan. Hitler had many misconceptions about the power of Japan and the weakness of the United States. In our timeline, Hitler's advisors warned that a war against the US only would harm the Reich. However, Hitler dismissed their opinions. This alternate timeline can be split between two different scenarios, each created from one decision.
He either listens to his advisors or he doesn't.
Whether Nazi Germany would declare war on the United States. So, first scenario, Hitler decides to go to war. If Nazi Germany successfully defeated their enemies in Europe, a declaration of war by the Reich would be much more of a threat in this alternate timeline. When Hitler declared war in our own timeline, it was seen as an opportunity for the Americans to get involved in the war. Even though the situation in 1941 was grim, it was not lost. Germany was fighting on two fronts, and declaring war on America brought a new player into the European theater. German leaders knew that Germany had no capabilities to strike the US directly. In this alternate timeline, the Germans would need to invest in long-range bombers to attack the US, creating the America Bomber Project. In our timeline, Hitler always wished to bomb the East Coast with nuclear or conventional weapons, yet he focused resources on weapons of science fiction, and not on easily achievable inventions such as long-range bombers. In this scenario,
but would they even really successfully make their target? I feel like the United States fleet would, they'd get shot down before they even got to the coast.
Even if the America Bomber is developed, the aircraft couldn't fly from North America and back, so it would need to be sacrificed over enemy territory. A simple bombing run wouldn't be worth destroying a plane over, so the payload needed to be greater. If a war between the Americans and Germans began in this alternate timeline, it's unlikely either could or want to launch a land invasion into the enemy continent. It would be too costly. The war between both is on two phases: conventional air and naval warfare, and the race for nuclear weapons. The atomic bomb wouldn't be the weapon to end the war as in our timeline against Japan, it would be a weapon to make bombing runs worthwhile across the Atlantic. In this alternate timeline, whoever developed a nuclear weapon and successfully could drop it on the enemy has the political and military advantage over the other, so the race is on. Neither would gain a reasonable advantage in the naval campaign, and so war is simply to defend coastal cities from the other. Even though Japan attacked the United States, Germany was much more of an immediate threat. Most American technological resources would go to getting an advantage over Germany, coastal defenses, and preparations for German bombing runs. However, Japan still attacked the US, so the US would still fight a Pacific War against the Japanese. Japan never would have been able to defeat the Americans. The US controlled their oil supply, and both sides knew Japan was outclassed economically by the United States. Japan couldn't rebuild lost ships. US could. For Japan, it was
Yeah, fighting the US for the Japanese was pretty much like fighting a Hydra. You destroyed one ship, 4 more took its
always
place.
going to be a losing battle. This alternate Pacific War could be very similar to our own, considering nothing occurs in the mainland US, up until the very end. In our timeline, the only reason the atomic bomb was allowed to drop was because the political climate allowed it. Japan's allies were defeated, Japan was isolated, and the US was tired of war. There were no major political repercussions for such a final act. In this alternate timeline, even if the United States had a nuclear bomb, they wouldn't use it on Japan. They would only use it on
and I read an article where scientists truly believed, and it seems that at the start of the development of the nuclear bomb was always at the beginning, up until maybe, I read it was like maybe around 1943 was when the idea shifted from being used on Germany and instead possibly to be used on Japan should they not surrender. But started the development of bomb. Scientists developing it thought they were only going to drop it on Germany for many years.
Germany if they had the opportunity, as was the original plan before the defeat of Hitler in our timeline. If the US pushed Japan back in this alternate scenario, the policy is to contain and firebomb the Japanese homeland. Firebombings of Japanese cities killed more than the nuclear bombs. Since to the Americans the Japanese aren't important enough targets for nuclear weapons, the Americans simply destroy Japanese will and economic capability to wage war, the conventional way. So in this alternate scenario, the US obliterates Japan's cities nationwide, devastating.
Honestly, this result might be worse for Japan than actually the nuclear bombs were, because they're not the focus, but you still gotta maintain pressure on them to get them to stop fighting. And so you're just gonna drop bombs upon bombs on them. You're not gonna send troops in to fight them, because obviously an invasion of the homeland is a suicidal mission. But you'll just keep dropping bombs on them to completely keep them out of the war. This is gonna cost way more lives for Japan than our timeline war did.
The entire country. After months of Dresden-style bombings on Japan, the country literally cannot fight anymore. If Japan surrendered, we'd see a similar occupation as in our timeline. If not, the US invades and the air bombings obliterate every Japanese town and village. The populace cannot fight off an invasion, no matter their willpower. This alternate path is only possible if the United States develops a nuclear weapon before Nazi Germany. So would Germany have gotten the bomb before the United States? No. In our timeline, many factors led to the US having an advantage over the Germans in nuclear development. The US had both British and German scientists who were scared of the Nazis. Also, Germany could not invest as much energy into nuclear research as Americans, as most German effort went into the Russian conflict. Yet even with some changes by the alternate timeline, it's unlikely the Germans could have held on to their new territory and developed a nuclear bomb while at naval war with the United States. The US, who would deal with much less internal pressures, has a greater advantage over the Nazis. Just because the US would create a bomb first, does not mean Germany could not create a bomb at all. Even with a nuclear attack in this alternate timeline, it wouldn't cripple a nation. It'd be a political blow, maybe even a tool to create unrest, but realistically brings the world into an age where nuclear warfare is the new normal. An atomic strike by either side in this alternate timeline is a dangerous prospect,
that's an
as while
interesting image there.
devastating, it still allows the other nation to retaliate back. So I'm concluding in this alternate timeline, if the United States and Germany did go to conflict, it's very likely it would collapse into nuclear war, even limited nuclear war, with cities on the coast such as New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. being destroyed. As the devastation would commence, protests and riots would occur as people fear for their lives across both Europe and North America. As rocket technology advances, the nuclear war could expand across the continents, in a scenario very similar feared in the Cold War, utterly destroying both nations as nukes bring social unrest to even the Third Reich itself. Now earlier I mentioned there would be two different scenarios which could occur from one decision. The first was Hitler decides to go to war. The second is Hitler decides not to. In the second scenario, Hitler listens to his generals and realizes that it isn't in his best interest to help Japan and attack the US. So in this alternate scenario, the US can focus all of its energy on Japan in the Pacific War, still pretty similar as in our timeline. However, the Americans are in constant worry that Hitler may change his mind and launch a naval war against the US in the Atlantic. In our timeline, after the atrocities of the Holocaust and the millions of deaths in Hitler's war, Nazism was discredited forever. Americans can't imagine fascism ever being considered. However, before the war, in the turbulent Great Depression, the boasting, flag-toting fascists certainly had an appeal to some in North America, even among prominent American capitalists. In our timeline before the war, company leaders admired Adolf Hitler for his boasting personality. Hitler won over many prominent American businessmen with cheap labor policies. Both parties shared similar views on communists and labor forces. Both parties were incredibly anti-Semitic, as many were at the time. Germany in the 1930s became a suitable market for American companies to invest in, no matter what their government said. Even during the war itself, American companies remained in contact with their German counterparts. In this alternate timeline, without a war, this relationship blooms to its full potential. With the Nazis having won the war and resistance practically useless, companies are the first to accept the new order as a valuable market. In our timeline, Hitler held complex views of the United States. He saw that the country had a sizable population of ethnic Germans, and attributed most of the country's accomplishments to them. Yet he also despised the influence of the Jewish and black populations in the country. He admired the US racial segregation and eugenic policies it employed on minorities. Hitler believed that the Aryan majority of the United States was being controlled by a government under a Jewish conspiracy. He personally hated President Roosevelt. Since the Nazis had relatable views already held in many places in the US, segregation, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, without a war, the Nazis would become less despised by parts of the country as years went on. The Nazis were still German, which was better to the US than the Japanese. But would this mean the American public would accept Nazism? With fascism certainly establishing itself by force in Europe, would it leak into the American political atmosphere as well? In the 1930s, fascism never gained mainstream traction. It was simply anti-American in the political sense. Even groups like the KKK, which preached for white supremacy, still disagreed with Adolf Hitler's authoritarianism. Their constitution was still seen as the greatest government document to run the country. In this alternate timeline, the success of Hitler in Europe inspires homegrown groups inside the United States. True political authoritarian fascism never would take off in the US. However, the social views of racial segregation and anti-Semitism could easily be more reinforced and appeal to the American whites. In this alternate timeline, if the United States and Nazi government never went to war, some American whites would attempt to model their country's social policy off of the Germans, at least to an extent.
And you know what? I'm going to build off of this thought process here. You could also argue because, you know, what war does, war kind of brings about social equality, because when war happens, obviously the male population gets shipped off to war. Well, you still need to produce goods and you need to produce things for the war effort. But if all the men are off, adult male population are off fighting, well, then who's going to pick up the pace at home and continue building the goods? Women. Women will get a chance. And then, of course, if the war is such a total war in which a lot of people need to fight, you know, that'll bring in minorities into the fight, and then that helps bring about, you know, social change, because it's like, yo, these minorities helped fight for our country. We got to give them something, right? So really, war helps. Sadly, the death of lots of people tends to have a good outcome sometimes. Now, of course, not a lot of the time. I won't say a lot of the time, but sometimes war is good for social change.
The civil rights movement gained steam, many whites would look to the Nazis. In this alternate timeline, if Nazism did not crash and the Third Reich remained prominent, it could influence populations far outside its empire. Americans might even view the Nazis as destroyers of communism, as the Soviet Union was incredibly unpopular amongst the population. If Nazi Germany boomed economically, the success drives even more Americans to Nazi beliefs. Civil rights progress is set back decades as Nazism is an influence for Europeans across the globe. While the two countries officially would be cold enemies, the US holds many Nazi sympathizers. These sympathizers can vote, creating a potential Nazi base within the US voter population. Politics change in the US revolving around whether to befriend or to hate the Third Reich. Since Hitler's decision not to go to war with the US does not end in a nuclear war, this scenario of Nazi and American fragile peace is the one which we continue with for the rest of the series. In part 4, the United States is left with a choice: to accept the new order which has fallen on Europe, or to continue in a path of defending its interests and allies, even the former British Empire, which now is headed by the royal family across the Canadian border.
Alright, that was What If Germany Won World War II, Part 3. I've got nothing really here to add on. I think I said what I needed to say with that last bit on, social change and whatnot. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.